After the markers and flow labels are in place, you can define specific areas where you'd like to maintain a certain elevation difference between markers, and even before you establish elevations at any of the key points, it might be a good idea to set those constraints first. So for example, let's look at this intersection. I'll zoom into it. And say we already know that we're going to control our grading from downhill to uphill, and we want this to be about 0.5% or maybe 1% maximum here. Probably be 0.5% here, but that depends on the road grade here, obviously. Well, let's say we just want to maintain a maximum of 1% between these two design markers. So if we go to vertical control and go to the constraints panel, the second option allows you to actually create the constraints. So we'll create a constraint at grade. And we'll go from this point to that point, and we'll go through a curved path. And right now the grade between those two design markers is 0%, so we're going to say we're going to max that out at 1%. So since our grades are rounded, we get the 0.99%. So since we're on this topic right now, I'll show you how to make that 1%. Back in your vertical control tab of your ribbon, if you go down to the flow label settings, modify those, and we're going to change this to precise calculation method. So that fixes that to 1%. Another thing about flow labels is that you can move those anywhere you want in the drawing. They're not special. They reference the data that ASE is managing, but it doesn't do anything to it. So you could erase the flow label, it would have no effect. And you can move each of the components independently. So we've established a 1% grade from this marker to that marker. So when these elevations start changing, that 1% will stay there. And that's how you create a constraint. So I'll go through the remainder of the site and create constraints where I think I may need them in this design. Let's say that I want to maintain a 1% grade through this knuckle just to start out with. I'll create a constraint, or 3 constraints at 0.5%. So I'll go by grade, from, to, curved, and we'll say 0.5. Repeat that. And direction is important here because the value measures from the first marker picked to the next marker picked. So you can see our current grade is minus 0.076 because we've already got an elevation established at the first design marker. So we'll set this one to 0.5% to override the existing value, and we'll repeat the process again for the last section of this knuckle. And we're going to go 0.5. So you can see that we're constraining the grades between these points, but we're also establishing elevations, and the markers are all dependent on the marker at the top of the hierarchy. I'll maintain a 0.5% through this knuckle as well. For this particular design, we're going to use the design markers for full control of our elevations instead of the Civil 3D layout profile, which we can also use, but that won't be covered in this video. This is just the essentials of getting your design done. So we'll create another constraint here at 2% down from the crown. We'll go from the crown to the back of curve, linear, minus 2%. Now in this scenario, we've created a constraint starting here and ending here. However, since this will likely be an existing elevation that needs to be matched, we'll take this constraint and reverse it. So there's no reverse function on the constraint. So to change the direction in terms of the hierarchy, you'd actually have to delete the constraint first. So now we'll recreate it in the correct direction. We'll start at the existing, go to the finished ground through that curve, and we'll say 1% here. One of these will be dependent and the other independent, depending on how the grading turns out. But we'll go ahead and start the existing elevations, and we'll adjust the values of our constraints as we move along for design. We'll take this one at 0.5%. because we will be grading across the pavement here down into a low point that will likely be in this area.